How many victims actually were there? Well, Microsoft's encyclopedia called Encarta says that Torquemada was the most famous inquisitor of the Spanish Inquisition, um, and of the first 50 years, which were the worst time period. And so Torquemada, according to the Encyclopedia Encarta, says the Torquemada executed thousands. The Encyclopedia of Religious Freedom puts Torquemada's total at 10,000. Another historian, Edmund Paris, he claimed that another 125,000 died of torture and privation in Torquemada's prisons. So just to give you some context, these are the exaggerated claims I'm giving you now. All right. Some historians have estimated that during the effective lifetime of the Inquisition, more than 31,000 people were burned at the stake. Simon Whitechapel claims well over 100,000 died just under Torquemada alone in the first 50 years. Another historian says that the Inquisition burned nearly 200,000 in 36 years. And a historian named David Hunt claims that the Inquisition condemned more than 3 million, with about 300,000 burned at the stake. So these numbers were from Rodney Stark. These are the exaggerated numbers. What are the actual numbers? So the actual numbers, well, the first 50 years of the Spanish Inquisition are more poorly documented, but historians now agree that these were its bloodiest days, and perhaps somewhere between 1,500 to 2,000 people were executed, approximately 30 per year or so. Turning to the fully recorded period, though, remember I mentioned the 44,674 cases. Of those cases, only 826 people were executed. And so this is the answer to your question you asked earlier. That's 1.8% of those brought to trial, Kirk, were actually executed. All told, then, during the entire period of from 1480 through to 1700, only about 10 deaths per year across Spain for the Spanish Inquisition. Now, in contrast, think of England, like you mentioned, Kirk. In contrast, under Henry VIII, there were many thousands of Lutherans, Lollards, and Catholics, in addition to two of his wives, that Henry VIII is credited with having boiled, burned, beheaded, or hanged.
Wow, again, he did more than the whole Spanish Inquisition together.
Yeah.
Henry VIII.
It turns my stomach to even say something like that, but that is what was happening. And then during the next century after Henry, the English averaged 750 hangings per year. 750 per year, many of them just for minor thefts. But in contrast, the few who were sentenced to death by the Spanish Inquisition usually were repeat offenders who would just not repent. What about torture? Well, it's been taken for granted that many more poor souls died in the Inquisition's prisons and torture chambers than survived long enough to go to the stake. But this may be the biggest lie of all. All the courts of Europe used torture, but the Inquisition did far less than the other courts. And even there's a description here of what the church had rules for what torture could be allowed, and could be no more than 15 minutes, should be no danger to life or limb, no blood could be shed. But even reading this kind of makes me sick to my stomach. But you could still, even within those rules, you could have extremely painful techniques. But torture was rarely used because the inquisitors themselves were skeptical of its efficacy and even the validity of torture. Like people today, torture is used by our governments around the world. People deny it, but it's happening. But the argument against this is you're not going to get the truth from torture. People are just going to give you whatever you want to hear, right?
Yeah.
So I'm sure they were thinking the same thing then. So if torture was used, its progress was carefully recorded by a clerk, and this material was included in the record of the case. And so based on this data, Thomas Madden estimated that the inquisitors resorted to torture in only about 2% of all the cases that came before them. And then here's another key point. It's widely agreed that the prisons operated by the Inquisition were far more comfortable and humane in Europe. In fact, instances have been reported of criminals in Spain purposely blaspheming so that they could be transferred to the Inquisition's prisons because they were nicer.
The effect of religion in this case, as heinous as the things we're discussing, actually had a moderating effect on what the secular government, or basically the non-religious approach to crime, was committing at the same time. So at least it was improving the situation, even if it's still completely unacceptable.
Right, exactly. So let me get to the actual numbers now. Death toll would be of about 2,000 executions for the notorious first 50 years. And in the following 300 years, there were a further 3,000 executions. So 5,000 in total. If you compare that with the worst of Torquemada, or if you compare the worst of Torquemada's time with the last 45 years of state executions in the United States, it's about the same. More soberingly, we could compare it with the Reign of Terror in revolutionary France during the so-called Age of Enlightenment. Okay, so this is the Reign of Terror. That was basically a revolt against the Catholic Church. And in the 9 months following the storming of the Bastille in 1789, 17,000 were executed in the name of liberty, equality, and fraternity.
And that'd be secular there. That'd be very secular, that's French
right.
Revolution.
That's right. That's a secular response to the church, and you had 17,000 in 9 months. Or compare it with the Red Terror following the Russian Revolution, 1917, and the best estimates there set the probable number of executions at about 100,000. That's 1,400 times the rate of the Spanish Inquisition. These 5,000 deaths are a dark stain on the history of the church. Each one is a sin against the person killed, as well as a crime against freedom of conscience. Persuasion, not power, ought to be the means by which influence is spread, and every death in the name of Christianity is an assault on that principle. It is truly dark. But then, why do we recoil so instinctively from such an imposition of force? Scrivener says, once again, the crooked line testifies to the straight line, by which he's referring to Jesus Christ's teaching is the straight line that we're using to judge the crookedness here.